It had been years since the Carter family took a vacation together. Between school events, work commitments, and the endless cycle of daily life, moments of togetherness seemed fleeting and far between. That's why, when Sarah suggested the idea of a trip to the coast, her husband Daniel was quick to agree. The children, Jason and Emily, were equally enthusiastic at the thought of leaving behind the familiar noise of city life and the constant interruptions of technology. The place Sarah found was perfect, or so it seemed. A secluded beach, miles away from civilization, no hotels, no crowds, no tourists. Just an old, abandoned beach house on the cliffside, overlooking the vast, ever-changing ocean, a weekend away from everything. That was all they needed. The day started early, with the family cramming their luggage into the car. Sarah had made sure to pack everything: sunscreen, snacks, books, games for the kids, and even extra blankets. Daniel loaded the cooler with drinks and food. Jason and Emily were already bickering about who would sit in the front, and the sound of their voices echoed through the spacious car, the familiar banter of family life. It felt normal, after hours on winding roads, through small towns that grew increasingly sparse. They finally turned down a narrow, unmarked path, flanked by thick trees and wild brush. The air was dense with the scent of salt water and pine. "This is it," Sarah said, looking at the map on her phone. "It should just be up ahead." Daniel squinted through the windshield. "I don't see anything." "There's an old road, remember?" she said. "We just have to keep going." Minutes passed, and the car tires crunched over gravel and stone. The trees began to thin, revealing a jagged coastline ahead. The dark waves crashing against the shore like an untamed beast, and then, there it was. The house. The house looked like something out of a forgotten dream. It was perched precariously on a cliff, its windows wide and vacant, the once white walls now weathered and peeling from years of neglect. The roof sagged slightly, and the edges of the porch had been worn down by salt and wind. A large deck overlooked the beach, where the sand stretched for miles, empty and untouched. "Wow," Emily whispered. "It's kind of spooky." Jason, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "It's just old. Who cares? Let's go check it out." The family unloaded the car, carrying their belongings into the house. The wooden door creaked as Sarah pushed it open, the air inside stale and musty, like it had been shut for years. Dust particles danced in the dim sunlight that filtered through the thick curtains. The furniture was old, but mostly intact. A large, faded sofa, a coffee table stacked with brittle magazines, a rusted stove in the kitchen. It had been a while since anyone had lived here, but it wasn't completely derelict. There was a strange beauty to it, a sense of mystery that intrigued them all. "This place is interesting," Daniel said, walking through the kitchen. "A little old-fashioned, but we'll make it work." They chose rooms for the night. Sarah and Daniel in the master bedroom, Emily and Jason in the one next door. The kids immediately began to fight over who got the larger bed, but Sarah quickly intervened. "All right, let's just get settled and explore the beach. I think we all need a little fresh air." They changed into their swimsuits, grabbing towels and sunscreen before heading out the door. The sound of the waves grew louder as they stepped onto the deck, and the saltwater air hit their faces, cold and invigorating. The beach was eerie in its emptiness. The sand was untouched, the waves crashing relentlessly against the shore as if the ocean were calling out in some ancient, forgotten language. There was no one else for miles in either direction. It felt like they had stumbled upon a hidden paradise, but it was one that had been abandoned by humanity long ago. "Let's walk down the beach," Daniel suggested. "It's a perfect day for it." They walked, the sand soft beneath their feet, the cool breeze tousling their hair. Emily picked up seashells, Jason skipped stones, and Sarah and Daniel held hands, occasionally glancing at the horizon. "Do you think anyone else comes here?" Emily asked, stopping to look around. "Nope," Jason replied confidently. "This place is like a ghost beach." "That's not funny," Emily said, glaring at him. But Jason was right about one thing. There was something unnerving about the isolation of the place. No other footprints, no sign of life, just the waves and the wind. They walked for what felt like hours, past jagged rocks and tide pools, until they reached a small, rocky cove at the far end of the beach. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, painting the water in deep shades of orange and pink. "This is beautiful," Sarah said, her voice soft. "It's like we're the only people left in the world." Just then, the wind picked up and a sudden chill swept through the air. Jason shivered and looked around. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Hear what?" Daniel asked, looking at him. Jason paused, his brow furrowed. "I thought I heard someone calling, like a whisper, from the rocks." "No one's here, Jace," Emily said, laughing nervously. "It's just the wind." But Jason wasn't so sure. He glanced at the rocks again, and for a brief moment, he could have sworn he saw something moving. A shadow, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Let's head back," Daniel said, his tone more urgent than it had been before. "It's getting late, and we don't want to be caught out here in the dark." They made their way back to the house, the eerie feeling of being watched never quite leaving them. As the evening fell, the family settled back into the beach house. The air grew colder, and the sky outside darkened to a deep purple. Inside, they lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, the flames crackling and casting shadows on the walls. The kids played cards at the kitchen table, while Sarah and Daniel sat on the couch, sipping wine and chatting about the day. "That was a nice walk," Sarah said, her eyes wandering to the window. "I didn't think there'd be so much emptiness. It's almost like the beach is deserted." Daniel nodded, his gaze drifting to the same window. "It's peaceful, though. Maybe that's why people don't come here anymore. It's not for everyone." They both fell silent as the wind began to howl outside. The fire crackled louder, its warmth pushing back the cold creeping in from the night. Jason suddenly appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Mom, Dad, I'm not feeling too good," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "Oh, what's wrong?" Sarah stood up, concerned. "You're not sick, are you?" Jason shook his head slowly. "I don't know. It's just, it feels like something's wrong. Like, there's someone else here." Daniel frowned. "Jason, there's no one else. It's just us." "No, Dad," Jason insisted. "There's something in the house. I heard it. A voice." Sarah exchanged a glance with Daniel. "A voice? What are you talking about?" "I don't know," Jason muttered. "It was like someone was calling my name. But when I looked, no one was there." Daniel stood up, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Listen, Jace. You've been out in the sun all day. You're probably just hearing things. There's nothing to be scared of." But deep down, Daniel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in his chest. Something wasn't right. He had heard it too. The faintest whisper carried on the wind. It came again. A soft, almost inaudible sound, like a breath. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded slowly. "I heard it." They all stood in the quiet of the room, listening to the wind outside, the crackle of the fire, and then the soft whisper. It wasn't the wind. The whisper came again. It was faint, so faint that at first they thought it was just the wind. But there was something strange about it, something too deliberate. It wasn't random gusts or the rustling of trees. It was a voice, barely audible, calling from somewhere deep within the house. "Sarah?" it whispered. Sarah froze. Her hand, which had been clutching the wine glass, trembled as she set it down on the table. Daniel, his expression tense, slowly turned to face her. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. "It said my name. It sounded like it was coming from upstairs." Jason was standing by the fireplace now, his face pale. I told you there's something here." "Jason, stop," Emily said sharply. "You're scaring me." But Jason's eyes were wide, searching the shadows in the corners of the room. "I'm not lying. I heard it too." The silence that followed was thick. The whisper had stopped, but the unease lingered, curling around them like a fog. "Let's just go upstairs," Daniel said, standing up. "We'll check it out. It's probably just the wind moving through the house or something. We're all tired, and it's probably just playing tricks on us." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The voice sounded too real, too personal. She had lived in old houses before, places with creaking floors and drafts, but this was different. This felt intentional. "We'll go together," she said, taking Jason's hand. "Let's check it out." The family made their way up the narrow staircase that creaked underfoot, the air growing colder with every step they took. As they reached the top of the stairs, the landing stretched before them, two doors, one to the left and one to the right. The house was silent now, too silent, as though it were holding its breath. The whisper came again, this time from the door on the left. "Sarah?" The voice sounded as though it was coming from inside the room, and it chilled Sarah to the bone. She glanced at Daniel, and he nodded, pushing open the door with a slow, deliberate motion. Inside, the room was empty, nothing out of place. The bed was unmade, and a chair sat in the corner, facing the window. The moonlight poured through the cracks in the curtains, casting eerie shadows across the floor. But the room, though cold, was still and lifeless. No sign of movement, no strange presence. "See?" Daniel said, his voice strained. "Nothing, just an old room." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She stepped inside, walking slowly toward the window. The ocean could be seen from here, its waves crashing relentlessly against the shore. Suddenly, Jason let out a sharp gasp. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice quivering. Jason was pointing toward the wall near the bed. At first, Sarah thought it was just an old stain, but as she looked closer, her heart skipped a beat. There, scratched into the wood of the wall, were words. They weren't written in ink or paint. They were carved into the surface, deep and jagged. "Sarah, it's your name," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah's blood ran cold. There, carved into the wall, were the words, "Sarah, stay. You can't leave." The letters were uneven, as though they had been scratched hastily with something sharp, maybe a knife or a piece of glass. The chilling message seemed to shimmer in the dim light, its meaning clear and unmistakable. Daniel's hand instinctively reached for Sarah's, and he pulled her back from the wall, his face tense with fear. "Okay," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We need to get out of here. Now." But it was already too late. The house began to feel different. The air grew thicker, colder. The sound of the wind outside had stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence. The walls seemed to close in around them, and Sarah could feel the weight of the place pressing down on her chest. "What's going on?" Emily whispered, clutching onto her mother's side. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice tight, "but I think we need to leave. Right now." They moved toward the stairs, but as they reached the landing, something strange happened. The lights flickered once, twice, before plunging the house into complete darkness. "Dad?" Jason cried out, his voice trembling. "I can't see anything." Hold on," Daniel said, his voice calm but strained. "Everyone stay together." The silence was deafening now. They could hear nothing but the sound of their own breathing, ragged and quick. It was as if the world had suddenly turned off, leaving only them in a vacuum of dread. Then, a sound. Faint at first. A tapping. A gentle, almost rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a surface. It echoed through the house, growing louder, closer. "Where's it coming from?" Emily whispered, her voice quivering, and no one answered. The tapping was now accompanied by soft, muffled footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving in the darkness. "Who's there?" Daniel called out, his voice strong but betraying his fear. But there was no reply. Instead, the tapping grew more frantic, more urgent, and then, to their horror, they heard something far worse, a voice that wasn't just whispering now, but speaking clearly, as if directly to them. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come." The words were slow, deliberate, as though they were being drawn out of the air itself, twisted and distorted. The family froze. The voice was close, very close. "Who are you?" Sarah managed to choke out, her heart pounding in her chest. But the voice didn't respond. Instead, the house seemed to groan, a deep, guttural sound like the timbers of a ship creaking in a storm. The walls shook violently, and the floor beneath them trembled as though something ancient and powerful was awakening. The air turned frigid. Each breath they took burned in their lungs, and the smell of the sea, once fresh, now reeked of decay and salt. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut, rattling the entire house. The windows, once cracked and letting in moonlight, were now completely black, like eyes that had been gouged out. The house was alive, and it was angry. Panic spread like wildfire through the Carter family. Jason screamed as the footsteps grew louder, the unseen presence drawing closer. Daniel tried to move toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The more he pulled, the more it seemed as though the door was being held shut from the other side. "Please, let us out," Sarah cried, banging her fists against the door. "Please." But the house did not respond. Only the hollow echo of her words filled the air. Emily, her face pale, started sobbing. "What is this place? What is happening to us?" Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered back on for a brief moment, just enough to reveal something that no one could have prepared for. In the corner of the room, near the staircase, was a figure, a shadow. A woman. Her face was hidden in darkness, but Sarah could feel her gaze, cold and unrelenting, locking onto her. "Sarah," the figure whispered, and though the words were soft, they held an authority, a command that could not be ignored. "You cannot leave. Not yet." The terror was only beginning. The house had secrets buried deep within it, secrets that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And now, Sarah and her family were at the center of it all. The whispers, the shadows, the tapping, the cold. All were signs of something far older, far darker than they had imagined. And it was watching them. The figure in the corner remained motionless, but its presence was overpowering. The house seemed to close in around the family, and the air grew colder still. The woman's figure was barely discernible in the dim light, but Sarah could feel the weight of her gaze piercing through her. "Who are you?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might provoke something worse. The woman did not answer immediately. Instead, her silhouette flickered and wavered, like smoke caught in a draft. Then, in a voice that was impossibly cold, as though it came from the depths of the earth, she spoke again. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come here." The words were deliberate, drawn out as though she were savoring the terror they caused. The air seemed to thicken with each passing second, as if the very atmosphere of the house was breathing in time with the figure's voice. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky, but still trying to sound strong for the kids. The woman took a step forward, her form becoming clearer. She was dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, as though she belonged to a time long past. Her hair hung in dark strands around her face, but there was something wrong about her, something that made her look not quite human. Her skin was pale and stretched too tightly over her bones, and her eyes, though dark, seemed to reflect an unnatural light, like mirrors capturing the souls of the living. Sarah recoiled. "What do you want from us?" The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort or understanding. It was a smile that sent a jolt of icy fear straight through Sarah's heart. "I want you to stay," the woman whispered. "You were always meant to stay." Emily, trembling, clutched her mother's side tighter. "I want to leave. I want to go home," she cried. The woman's smile faded, her expression hardening. "You cannot leave. None of you can." As she spoke, the room seemed to pulse, the walls bending inward. The temperature plummeted. The fire in the hearth sputtered out, leaving nothing but shadows in the darkness. The very air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. "No," Sarah whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "What do you mean? Why can't we leave?" The woman took another step forward, closer now, her face impossibly close to Sarah's. The air reeked of rot, of something ancient and decayed. Her breath was cold on Sarah's cheek as she whispered, "The house is alive, and it has been waiting for you." With that, the woman seemed to melt into the shadows, disappearing into the corners of the room. The temperature in the room plummeted further, so much so that Sarah could see her breath hanging in the air, like mist. Suddenly, the house groaned, a deep, guttural sound that rattled the windows and made the floor tremble beneath their feet. It was as though the very bones of the house were shifting, waking up. Get out now," Daniel shouted, his panic now evident. He pulled at the door again, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping sound began again, louder, faster, as though something was moving, searching, closing in on them. Sarah could hear it coming from all directions now. Above, below, behind them. The walls were closing in, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The family was trapped. Jason suddenly screamed. The high-pitched sound cut through the air, piercing the tension that had settled in the room. "Jason?" Sarah screamed, turning toward her son. He was pointing toward the staircase, his face a mask of terror. "There's something coming down the stairs." Daniel rushed toward him. But when he turned to look at the stairs, there was nothing there. The shadows at the top of the stairs were dark, deep black pools that seemed to swallow the light. But there was no movement. "Jason, it's okay," Daniel said, trying to comfort him, though his own voice trembled. "There's nothing there." But Jason wasn't convinced. "I saw it. I saw it. It was moving in the dark." A low, creaking sound came from above, followed by another tap, then another. Then, unmistakably, the sound of someone, descending the stairs. It wasn't just a tapping sound anymore. There were footsteps now, slow, deliberate, as if the house itself was exhaling, its breath taking shape in the form of those footsteps. Sarah and Daniel exchanged frantic glances. The house was alive in a way they could never have imagined. It was pulling them deeper into its darkness, unwilling to let them leave. "Mom?" Emily sobbed. "Mom, what's happening?" The shadows at the top of the stairs thickened, as though something was stepping out from the darkness. Sarah couldn't bring herself to look, but she could hear it now. The sound of something breathing, the faint rustling of fabric. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, briefly illuminating the stairs. But what they saw was far worse than the darkness. Standing at the top of the stairs was a figure, half shadow, half substance. It was tall, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing like orbs of light, fixed on them with an intensity that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Ino?" Daniel shouted, pushing past his family to run toward the front door. He threw himself against it, pulling at the handle, but it didn't give. He began kicking the door, slamming his shoulder against it, desperation in his every movement. "Please, please," he shouted. "Let us out." The figure at the top of the stairs moved, slowly, like a puppet on invisible strings. It tilted its head at an unnatural angle, its eyes never leaving them, and then, just when Sarah thought they were beyond hope, the door opened. The wind outside howled as if it had been waiting for them. It carried the smell of salt and decay, the scent of the ocean, but it also carried something darker, something foul. The figure didn't move, but the house did. With a loud, grinding noise, the floor beneath them began to shift. The walls groaned, like the house itself was awakening, stretching, reaching for them. The doors creaked open wider, and the house seemed to breathe a long, drawn-out sigh, as though it were disappointed in them. "You cannot leave," the voice came again, but this time it wasn't just from one place. It was everywhere. The walls, the floors, the ceiling. The house was speaking, and it was angry. The wind outside was sharp and cold, but it was their only escape. Sarah could feel it, the pull, the lure of the open air. Without thinking, she grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the door. "Run!" she shouted to Daniel and Jason. "Run!" They sprinted outside, the air biting at their skin, but the house's grasp didn't loosen. The moment they stepped onto the porch, the shadows behind them lengthened, creeping across the ground like reaching fingers. "No!" Sarah screamed, turning to face the house one last time. The figure at the top of the stairs was watching them, its eyes glowing, its mouth forming the words, "Stay." But Sarah could feel something shifting inside her. The house was ancient, powerful, but it wasn't invincible. With one last, defiant scream, she turned and ran. The wind whipped her hair, and the night sky felt endless above her, but the darkness of the house followed them, a shadow on the horizon. They ran until their legs burned, until the house was just a silhouette in the distance, its windows dark and empty. And behind them, They could hear nothing but the sound of their own breath, but Sarah knew. The house was watching them, and it would never let them go.